By late 1965, as the United States began deploying large combat formations to South Vietnam, the American command believed that its superiority in helicopters, artillery, and air power would allow U.S. forces to control areas that the South Vietnamese Army had previously been unable to hold. Instead of depending on roads, American battalions could be flown directly into the battlefield by helicopter, establish a landing zone, locate enemy forces, and then use overwhelming firepower to destroy them. At the center of this new doctrine was the 1st Cavalry Division, which had been reorganized as an airmobile force equipped with hundreds of UH-1 helicopters, CH-47 transports, and armed gunships. In theory, an infantry battalion could leave its base, appear dozens of kilometers away within a few hours, fight under artillery support, and then be extracted before the enemy had time to concentrate its forces. On the other side, the High Command of the People's Army of Vietnam was also carrying out a calculated strategy. After years of supporting armed forces in the South, North Vietnamese main force regiments began moving deep into the Central Highlands. Their objective was not only to place pressure on outposts held by the Army of the Republic of Vietnam, but also to establish a continuous operational zone stretching from the Cambodian border to the routes leading toward the central coastal region. If these forces gained control of the Central Highlands, they could threaten to cut South Vietnam in two. But by concentrating too close to American bases, they also risked becoming targets of a firepower system that had never before been deployed on such a scale in the Vietnam battlefield. The Ia Drang Valley became the place where these two strategies collided directly. In October 1965, North Vietnamese forces attacked the Plei My camp while simultaneously preparing an ambush for Army of the Republic of Vietnam units moving from Pleiku to relieve it. The plan failed to achieve its intended result under pressure from American air power and counterattacking forces, forcing the North Vietnamese units to withdraw toward the Chu Pong area to reorganize. The American command immediately launched Operation Silver Bayonet to pursue them. By mid-November, Colonel Thomas Brown decided to deploy the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry Regiment, approximately 450 men under Lieutenant Colonel Harold Moore, to the base of the Chu Pong Massif. Moore selected Landing Zone X-Ray, a small clearing large enough for only about 8 helicopters to land at one time. As a result, the entire battalion had to be inserted in several waves, with each round trip taking approximately 30 to 35 minutes. This was the greatest weakness in the plan. If North Vietnamese troops were positioned near X-Ray, the first American units could be attacked before the rest of the battalion had time to land. On the morning of the 14th of November 1965, American artillery began preparatory fire against the area surrounding Landing Zone X-Ray. Batteries of 105mm howitzers, positioned at fire bases to the east, shelled the tree line and the slopes of Chu Pong. Attack aircraft then struck several suspected positions before the first formation of helicopters moved in. At approximately 10:48 a.m., the UH-1 helicopters carrying Lieutenant Colonel Moore and the first soldiers of Company B landed at X-Ray. The downdraft from the rotor blades flattened the elephant grass against the ground. American troops rushed out of the helicopters and spread out to establish a defensive perimeter, while the Hueys immediately lifted off to collect the next wave. During the first few minutes, the area remained almost completely quiet. No fire was directed at the landing zone. Patrols moved into the surrounding tree lines, but found only a few small fighting positions and signs of recent movement. However, according to intelligence reports forwarded to the command post, several North Vietnamese battalions were concentrated in the Chu Pong area and might be actively seeking an engagement with American forces. Meanwhile, the air assault was still incomplete. Moore had only Company B and part of the supporting force on the ground, while the remaining helicopters were still flying between X-Ray and the departure point. Around noon, Company B began advancing northwest of the landing zone. Captain John Herron, the company commander, ordered his platoons to cross the dry creek bed and search the wooded ground leading toward Chu Pong. The 2nd Platoon, commanded by Lieutenant Henry Herrick, moved faster than the neighboring units. When a group of North Vietnamese soldiers appeared and then withdrew toward the mountain, Herrick decided to pursue them. His platoon pushed deeper through the brush and gradually became separated from the rest of Company B. At approximately 12:15 p.m., the leading American soldiers made contact with North Vietnamese forces. At first, the exchange consisted only of short bursts of rifle and light machine gun fire. Within the next few minutes, however, fire began coming from several directions. North Vietnamese units from the 66th Regiment were moving down from Chu Pong and advancing directly toward X-Ray. The enemy did not deploy along a fixed defensive line. Small infantry groups used the trees and tall grass for cover, repeatedly searching for gaps between the American platoons. Machine gun, rifle, and mortar fire began striking the positions held by Company B. Herrick's platoon was quickly cut off from the main formation. Once he recognized the situation, Herrick ordered his men to occupy a small rise and establish a circular defense. North Vietnamese troops, however, had already closed in from 3 directions. During the first clash, Herrick was critically wounded and later died. Command passed in succession to the surviving non-commissioned officers. Sergeant Clyde Savage took control of the radio and began directing artillery fire around the platoon's position. The 105mm shells were brought down extremely close to the defensive perimeter. Each time North Vietnamese troops began concentrating for another assault, Savage called for the artillery to shift to a new direction, creating rings of fire around the small rise. While the isolated platoon struggled to hold its position, the rest of Company B also came under increasing pressure. North Vietnamese units attempted to move through the dry creek bed and penetrate the gap between Company B and the landing zone. Some groups approached close enough to use grenades and automatic weapons. Moore immediately ordered Company A, commanded by Captain Ramon Nadal, to extend the perimeter toward the north and northwest. The immediate objective was to secure X-Ray while attempting to re-establish contact with the cut-off platoon. Each time the relief force advanced, however, it encountered fire from positions concealed deep within the trees. By early afternoon, the situation became more serious as North Vietnamese forces deployed additional troops toward the base of the mountain. The American battalion was still not fully concentrated. Troop-carrying helicopters had to land under mortar and machine gun fire, bringing in additional soldiers before evacuating the wounded from the landing zone. The helicopter crews of Company A, 229th Aviation Battalion, continued flying into X-Ray even though the area had not been secured. Major Bruce Crandall and Captain Ed Freeman organized repeated flights to deliver ammunition and water while carrying casualties to the rear. When medical evacuation helicopters were temporarily unable to approach because of enemy fire, the transport Hueys continued the evacuation mission. At approximately 2 p.m., Companies A and B attempted to advance toward Herrick's platoon. The American force moved through the tall grass under covering fire from M60 machine guns, 81mm mortars, and artillery. North Vietnamese fire from the tree line, however, forced the formation to halt. The isolated platoon was only a few hundred meters away, but the Americans could not break through. The relief attempt was suspended. Moore ordered the units to return and strengthen the X-ray perimeter before nightfall. Throughout the afternoon, repeated attacks struck the western and northwestern sides of the landing zone. American artillery fired continuously from nearby fire bases. Forward air controllers directed F-100S, A-1 Sky Raiders, and armed helicopters against positions near the base of Chu Pong. Supporting fire enabled the battalion to hold its perimeter, but the distance between the two sides was often dangerously small. Pilots had to drop bombs and napalm just beyond the American positions, while artillery shells struck coordinates only a few dozen meters from the defensive line. North Vietnamese units attempted to remain close to the American formation to reduce the effectiveness of airstrikes, forcing much of the fighting to be conducted with small arms and grenades. By late afternoon, all companies of the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had been inserted into X-ray. Company C, commanded by Captain Bob Edwards, held the southern and southeastern sectors. Company D positioned its mortars, machine guns, and anti-tank elements near the center of the perimeter. The wounded were gathered near the command post, in shallow fighting positions and behind termite mounds. At approximately 6 p.m., daylight began to fade. Moore ordered the companies to tighten the perimeter, check their ammunition, and prepare for a night attack. Illumination rounds were fired continuously, while artillery maintained harassing fire along the approaches leading from Chu Pong toward X-ray. Outside the main perimeter, the isolated platoon continued to hold the small rise. After several hours of fighting, the unit had suffered heavy casualties, and its original chain of command had almost completely collapsed. Savage and the remaining survivors formed a small defensive circle, using fallen trees and low ground for protection from enemy fire. They could not withdraw to X-ray. North Vietnamese forces, however, were also unable to overrun the position under the continuous artillery fire being adjusted by radio. During the night of November 14 and the early hours of November 15, small probing attacks continued around the perimeter. North Vietnamese forces tested the defensive line with mortar and small arms fire, while the Americans held their positions and limited their return fire to avoid revealing the locations of their machine guns. Almost no one was able to rest. Ammunition was redistributed among the platoons. Every soldier still capable of fighting was moved to the outer line. Doctors and medics worked in the center of the perimeter under limited light, while helicopters were unable to land regularly during the night. The first day at X-ray ended without either side achieving a decisive objective. The Americans still held the landing zone but remained surrounded near the base of Chu Pong. The North Vietnamese had isolated one platoon and inflicted significant casualties, but they had been unable to break the perimeter under the weight of American artillery and air power. The battle had not yet reached its most violent stage. At approximately 6:20 a.m. on November 15, while mist still covered part of the landing zone, North Vietnamese forces launched a major attack against the southern and southeastern sectors of X-ray. The main objective was the area defended by Company C. The assault began with mortar and machine gun fire directed against the outer line. Immediately afterward, several infantry groups advanced simultaneously through the elephant grass from the tree lines to the south. The distance between the two sides rapidly collapsed. Some American positions were struck from the flank before the defenders could fully determine the direction of the attack. Company C suffered casualties within the first few minutes. Captain Edwards was wounded, and several platoon officers and non-commissioned officers were put out of action. The defensive line was forced back at several points, creating the danger that North Vietnamese troops might break through toward the command post and helicopter landing area. Moore sent reserve elements and headquarters personnel to reinforce the outer line. Signalmen, medics, and supply troops were issued additional ammunition and positioned behind termite mounds and individual fighting holes. Company D's mortars lowered their tubes and fired almost directly in front of the perimeter. As the pressure continued to increase, Moore transmitted the broken arrow signal, the emergency code indicating that an American unit was in danger of being overrun. All combat aircraft operating in the area were given priority orders to divert toward X-ray. Within a short time, several formations of aircraft appeared above the landing zone. Forward air controllers had to assign separate altitudes and attack directions to prevent collisions. Bombs, rockets, and napalm struck the tree lines at extremely close range from the American positions, while artillery maintained continuous blocking fire. One napalm strike landed too close to the defensive line, causing casualties among American troops. Most of the airstrikes, however, hit the areas through which the North Vietnamese were advancing, disrupting their formations and forcing many units to disperse. On the ground, Company C and the reinforcing elements managed to hold the line. Machine gun teams repeatedly shifted positions to prevent the enemy from exploiting gaps in the defense. Some North Vietnamese groups advanced very close to the command area, but they were unable to break through the final layer of fire. By approximately 9 a.m., the intensity of the attack began to decline. North Vietnamese forces withdrew from several positions close to the perimeter, leaving small groups behind to continue sniping and harassing the American defenses. The Americans used the lull to move casualties to the landing zone, receive additional ammunition, and reorganize their companies. During the morning, reinforcements began moving toward X-Ray. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry Regiment, commanded by Lieutenant Colonel Bob Tully, was inserted at Landing Zone Victor, several kilometers east of X-Ray. From there, the battalion advanced on foot through the jungle toward the battle area. Moving the troops overland from a separate landing zone reduced pressure on X-Ray, where helicopters were already occupied with delivering supplies and evacuating the wounded. At the same time, Tully's force could approach the North Vietnamese routes of advance from a new direction. Around midday, the first elements of the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry reached X-Ray. Their arrival allowed Moore to expand the perimeter and free part of his force to organize another attempt to rescue the isolated platoon. In the early afternoon, a combined force from Company B, 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and the reinforcing units advanced toward the small rise. This time, the movement was preceded by heavier artillery and mortar fire. Suspected positions along the route were struck before the infantry moved forward. When the relief force reached the position, the survivors of Herrick's platoon had held the small rise for more than a day. The platoon had suffered 8 men killed and many others wounded, but it had not been destroyed. The survivors and casualties were brought back to X-Ray under the protection of the reinforcing force. The rescue ended one of the most dangerous situations of the battle, but it did not end the fighting. Throughout the afternoon of November 15, North Vietnamese units continued to apply pressure from the direction of Chu Pong. American artillery kept firing into the mountain slopes, while aircraft struck trails and assembly areas to the west. The second night at X-Ray passed under tighter defensive conditions. The American force had now been reinforced by troops from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, and part of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry. The perimeter was reorganized, with companies positioned in an interlocking formation to prevent any single sector from becoming dangerously weak. Before dawn on November 16, North Vietnamese forces launched another attack against the sector held by the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, and the reinforcing units. This time, however, the Americans had sufficient troops on the ground, and their artillery fire plans had already been prepared. After prolonged fighting, the assault was stopped outside the perimeter. By 8 a.m. on November 16, the Americans had established firm control over X-Ray. North Vietnamese units gradually withdrew toward Chu Pong, avoiding further concentration under American air power. After nearly 3 days of fighting, Moore's 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was ordered to leave the landing zone. After the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry withdrew from X-Ray, the 2 remaining units, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry under Lieutenant Colonel Robert McDade and Lieutenant Colonel Tully's 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, continued to hold the area. The American command planned to use B-52 bombers against the Chu Pong Massif the following day. To clear the bombing zone and expand the search operation, both battalions were ordered to leave X-Ray on foot. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, would move toward Landing Zone Columbus, while the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, would march to Landing Zone Albany, a clearing approximately 6 kilometers from X-Ray. On the map, this appeared to be a relatively short movement. The American units did not believe they were beginning a major offensive operation. Many soldiers of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, had remained awake almost continuously for 2 days at X-Ray. The column was organized more like an administrative movement than an advance toward a new battlefield. On the morning of November 17, the 2 battalions left X-Ray. After moving together for part of the route, the force split into 2 columns. The 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry, advanced toward Columbus, while the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, continued north toward Albany. McDade's formation stretched into a long, single-file column through the jungle and elephant grass. The reconnaissance platoon led the way, followed by Alpha Company, the battalion headquarters, Delta Company, Charlie Company, and an attached element of Alpha Company, 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry. Because of the terrain and the spacing between units, the entire column extended for several hundred meters. In the early afternoon, the lead elements captured 2 North Vietnamese soldiers. At the same time, the reconnaissance platoon discovered fresh signs of movement around the Albany area. The seriousness of the threat, however, was not fully recognized. At approximately 1 p.m., the leading elements reached the edge of the landing zone. McDade ordered the column to halt and summoned the company commanders forward to receive instructions on how their units would be positioned before helicopters arrived to extract them. This order caused several company commanders to leave their units at the exact moment when the formation remained extended and had not established a defensive perimeter. Soldiers farther back stopped where they stood along the route. Some removed their packs, ate their rations, or lay down to rest in the grass. Many elements failed to establish proper security because they believed the march was nearly over. The Americans did not know that newly arrived North Vietnamese units were positioned in the forest to the right of the column. 2 battalions of the 66th Regiment and the remaining forces of the 33rd Regiment were moving near the Ia Drang River. Despite their losses at X-Ray, they remained capable of fighting and were searching for American units separated from the concentrated fire support system surrounding the landing zone. Between approximately 1:15 and 1:30 p.m., the two sides suddenly encountered each other at extremely close range. The battle did not begin with a preparatory bombardment. Rifle and machine gun fire erupted almost simultaneously along the right flank of the American column. North Vietnamese troops charged out of the trees directly into the halted formation, splitting the companies apart before they could establish a defensive line. The entire Albany area immediately descended into chaos. The formation of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was broken into several isolated groups. The lead elements and battalion headquarters moved into a cluster of trees near the landing zone and established a perimeter. The companies farther back were pinned down in the elephant grass, unable to see the headquarters or the neighboring units. Because the company commanders had gathered near McDade, many platoons and companies temporarily lost their immediate leaders. Junior officers and non-commissioned officers had to organize defenses on the spot. The dense vegetation and extremely close range of the fighting, however, quickly disrupted communications. North Vietnamese troops closed in so tightly that American artillery and aircraft found it difficult to distinguish between the opposing forces. Unlike X-Ray, where Moore had established a relatively continuous perimeter, Albany had no unified defensive line. Each group of American soldiers fought within its own isolated area, often without knowing whether the unit beside it was still holding or had already been overrun. Charlie Company suffered particularly heavy losses. When the attack began, the unit was positioned near the middle of the extended column and was struck from both the flank and the front. Many officers were hit during the opening minutes. The platoons were broken into smaller groups among the tall grass and were forced to defend themselves around individual trees and small clearings. Delta Company was also divided into several isolated elements. Some groups attempted to move toward the cluster of trees at Albany, but had to cross open ground swept by fire from both sides. Other groups remained in place, using machine guns and grenades to prevent North Vietnamese troops from closing in. At the rear of the column, Alpha Company of the 1st Battalion, 5th Cavalry, reacted more quickly because it had additional time to deploy after hearing the gunfire ahead. The company established its own perimeter, maintained its formation, and prevented the enemy from advancing farther south. It could not immediately move forward to assist the companies of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, however, because North Vietnamese forces had gained control of the ground between them. McDade's headquarters in the Albany tree cluster also came under continuous attack. Radio communications worked only intermittently. Staff officers attempted to determine the position of each company so they could call for artillery support, but the opposing forces were intermingled across a wide area. If the artillery landed too close, it risked inflicting heavy casualties on the Americans themselves. Attack aircraft were called in, but directing air support presented the same difficulty. Smoke, dense vegetation, and scattered groups of soldiers made it difficult for pilots to identify their targets. Several napalm and rocket strikes were directed against the edges of the battle area to prevent North Vietnamese forces from bringing in additional troops. For approximately 6 hours, Albany became a series of disconnected engagements. There was no unified assault or coordinated counterattack. Small groups of American soldiers fought to hold individual positions, while North Vietnamese forces attempted to destroy them one by one before reinforcements could arrive. By late afternoon, airstrikes and artillery fire began creating some separation between the two sides. North Vietnamese troops gradually withdrew from several areas, carrying away their wounded and weapons. Small groups, however, remained in the forest and continued firing at the American positions. As darkness fell, the survivors of the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, gathered into small defensive perimeters around Albany. The wounded lay among the formations, but helicopters were still unable to land safely. Search and evacuation efforts could only be conducted in stages under the light of illumination rounds. Forces from the 2nd Battalion, 5th Cavalry at Columbus, began moving toward Albany to provide support. Artillery batteries at Columbus also fired blocking missions around Albany to prevent the enemy from organizing another attack during the night. On the morning of November 18, American helicopters were finally able to approach the area regularly and evacuate the wounded and surviving troops. Only when the units reassembled and accounted for their men did the full scale of the losses become clear. The 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, suffered 155 men killed and 124 wounded at Albany. Many companies lost most of their officers and non-commissioned officers. In only a few hours, the battalion sustained heavier losses than the entire American force had suffered during 3 days of fighting at X-Ray. It was one of the deadliest single days endured by an American unit during the entire Vietnam War. After the battle at Albany, American forces continued to control several landing zones in the area, while B-52 bombers and tactical aircraft struck the Chu Pong Massif and the withdrawal routes leading toward Cambodia. However, most of the North Vietnamese forces that remained capable of maneuver had already left the immediate battle area. After 4 days of fighting, American forces had suffered 234 men killed and approximately 250 wounded. The United States estimated that more than 1,200 North Vietnamese soldiers had been killed, although the exact figure remains disputed because no official total was released by the Vietnamese side. Ia Drang revealed 2 completely different sides of airmobile warfare. At X-Ray, the 1st Battalion, 7th Cavalry, held the landing zone with the support of helicopters, artillery, and air power. Only 2 days later, however, the 2nd Battalion, 7th Cavalry, was struck at Albany while moving in an extended column, preventing supporting fire from intervening in time. The Americans viewed the battle as evidence that superior mobility and firepower could inflict heavy losses on the enemy. The North Vietnamese, however, concluded that this strength could be reduced if American units were engaged at close range, divided, and forced to fight before their supporting firepower could be fully employed. Ia Drang therefore produced no decisive victory for either side. American forces retained Plei Me and the landing zones, but they could not prevent the enemy from withdrawing into Cambodia and later returning to the Central Highlands. The battle merely marked the beginning of a much longer war, in which both sides continued to follow the opposing lessons they had drawn from the same valley.